appreciate the music that's provided for us by In Search of the Lord's Way. This is congregational singing that's recorded in Oklahoma. They have a singing night several times a year where they record this music and they put it on the internet, on their website, for any to use with credit. So I certainly do appreciate the music that we have for this series of lessons coming from In Search of the Lord's Way. Worship the Lord in the splendor of holiness. Psalm 92 verse 2. This is our theme verse for this series of lessons on worship. And as we enter into our study today, we'll be considering a topic that is often overlooked in terms of worship. We'll be considering giving as worship. Now, when we look at giving, we often brush it aside because it is something that's material, it's something just because it's dealing with money, people find it off-putting. And yet it's something that is very important. I find it a bit disturbing whenever we have our prayer for the contribution, the men leading go through verbal gymnastics to emphasize this time of giving is separate and apart from the Lord's Supper. Now, bear in mind when the song leader gets up to lead the invitation song, he doesn't say, now, just a minute now. Don't get confused that what I'm doing is preaching because the sermon's over and now I'm leading us. We don't do that. Why is it that we have this almost visceral reaction against giving? Or we'll make a proclamation. This is a convenience to take up the contribution now. Well, we don't say that about any other act of worship. We don't say, well, we're going to sing. We don't have to. It's just convenient. We don't do that. Giving is important. Now, when you look in the Old Testament and you learn through the example of God's dealing not only with the Jews, but going back to Cain and Abel offering sacrifices, of Abraham giving tithes. Giving is central to our worship of God. Now, as we consider giving, we need to recognize that there are some things in worship that are a checkbox. You either do them or you don't do them. Then there are other things that are matters of stewardship. Using singing, for example, we really don't have an option to not sing. We're commanded to sing, to teach and admonish one another. Now, how many songs we sing and in what style, whether psalms, hymns, or spiritual songs, whatever those divisions may mean, that's stewardship. So there are things where we can look and we can say, yes, we have done this, or no, we have not done it. Okay. And where there is a commandment, or where there is a clear example, we can look at it and we can check that off. When we consider giving, there are two things in the New Covenant. There are many, many in the Old. In the Old Testament, there are very specific laws concerning giving. By the way, the ancient Hebrews did not merely give 10%. The 10% was off the top. And then in addition to that, they had various offerings that they gave. So they gave much more. In addition, they had free will offerings beyond what was required. In the New Testament, there are a couple of bright lines, very clear indications of what we need to be doing in terms of our giving. First of all, and perhaps the most clear objective command, is found in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 2. Paul writes, on the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up, as he may prosper, so there will be no collecting when I come. Now look at this command. By the way, this is much clearer, binding our giving to the assembly on the first day than our observance of the Lord's Supper. We can say theologically it's clear that the Lord's Supper is so important. It is important. And yet, we only have example to tell us that it is on the first day of the week that communion is to be observed as we come together. That, and then reading between the lines with the Apostle Paul's description of the abuses of the Lord's Supper. But in this verse, we find very specifically, on the first day of every week. This is the clear statement we have, by the way, of the regular, repetitive gathering on the day of resurrection. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside. Now, notice he doesn't say how much to set aside. And from other passages, we find that that is left to the individual as we have purposed in our hearts. But we are to lay aside as we have prospered. It is entirely possible that someone has not prospered materially in the course of a week. Now, in our society, that's not very likely, but it could happen. In particular, there are individuals who only prosper once a year. When I was growing up, the congregation, where we were members, had an oddity in that the overwhelming majority of their budget was given in the month of December. And the reason for that is the largest contributors all were small businessmen. They all owned their own business, and they didn't know until they closed out their books whether they had prospered at all, and if so, how much. They took very seriously the idea that they should give as they were prospered, and so it was that they did that in that way. But this is a command, and this is something we can indeed check off. We can say we've either done this or we have not. Now, I will say, I am uncomfortable with the direction that has been taken very broadly in the brotherhood concerning electronic giving. In our congregation, we have embraced it, and by the way, it's been very successful. People have been giving, and I believe that's an appropriate thing. But in electronic giving, especially when something is set up to be a recurring payment, you have separated the giving on a regular basis. The first day of every week is what the text says. When you set something up, I have many things that I pay in a recurring way. I set the payment up one time, and from that day on, when all the ones I have on a recurring payment are either annual or monthly. But when the date comes, that payment is made, and I don't even think about it until I see a note in my inbox saying payment has been made. Separating the conscious volition, the will, the actual thought of giving from the act of giving is something I should think we ought to consider more carefully. I say that, however, I'm resigned to the fact that overwhelmingly our brethren feel this is appropriate, and this is the direction we have chosen to go, and I'm certainly not going to be contentious over it. I just raise it as a point that we need to take very seriously what the Apostle Paul has said. The first day of every week is to be a special time of giving. And then, also a bright line, something that we can check off and say we've either done it or not. 1 Timothy 5 verse 8, in discussing the financial support of widows, Paul says, "But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." Now we're going to be looking at the fact that we have the opportunity to do good to all people at all times. And that's a matter of stewardship. And you can't help everyone, and the question of how many people you do help and to what extent, well, that's something you have to wrestle with, and there's no way to check that off and say, I've done exactly what I ought to have done. But on this, it's different. Do you have family who are destitute? In particular, and especially whenever you look at what Jesus says about honoring your parents, you look at this text and the question is, do you have an aged parent, an aged relative who is destitute, and you are not taking care of them? Notice what Paul says. To do this, to not check that box off, in other words, to not obey the command, means you have denied the faith, and you're worse than an unbeliever. You're worse than an infidel if you don't take care of your family. Now, this is something that should resonate with us very firmly. With our giving, just as much as giving on the Lord's Day is important, giving financially to members of our family, even our extended family, who are in need, is something that we need to do if we're going to keep the faith. Now, these are, in the New Testament, the objective commands that are given. The things that we're able to look at and say, I've either done these or not. Most of our giving, however, falls into the realm of stewardship. And by the way, that should not surprise us, because most of our lives are lived under the banner of stewardship. Most of the decisions we make are Christ-affirming or Christ-denying, not because of an objective command, but because of an underlying principle. Now, there are commandments to be obeyed. So if you come to me and ask, is it all right for me to steal? I would tell you, no, it's not. Is it all right for me to lie? No, it's not. Is it all right for me to be sexually immoral? No, it's not. But if you come to me and say, how much time do I need to spend in prayer? Well, that's a very pertinent question, but I can't answer that. I can give you some guidelines, some principles, but you have to make application, and so it is with giving. We have the opportunity to do good to all people. The Apostle Paul says, inasmuch as you have opportunity, do good to all, especially to the household of faith. So the question is, do you have opportunity? And how much should you be doing? And to whom? This is something that is difficult to wrestle with because stewardship is a difficult proposition. We have to remember, though, stewardship rests on the premise all we have ultimately belongs to God. There is not an inch of our lives over which God does not claim sovereignty. First of all, He made us. We are His creation. But then secondly, He purchased us. When we were sold under sin, He purchased us through the blood of Christ. And so we owe our very selves to God. And anything that may be under our control, our finances, our time, our education, our relationships, all ultimately belong to God. And we are accountable for how we use these things to the glory of God. Looking at the idea of stewardship, we have to have a constant recalibration. We need to be looking into our lives and bringing ourselves into alignment with the will of God. Spending time in the Word of God, spending time in prayer, gathering together in worship. All of these things help us as we recalibrate our lives, as we reflect on who we are and what God expects us to do. And so it is with our giving. We should constantly be looking at our position in terms of material wealth and ask, how should I be using this? How should I use it to the glory of God? And we need to constantly be changing because none of us get it right. All of us have room for improvement. Stewardship on that basis requires humility. It's recognizing that if you do the best you can, it's almost certain that you get some of the specific decisions you make wrong. You help somebody financially and maybe it wasn't a wise decision. I think in terms of the people panhandling, the realization that for most of these people, you actually hurt them by placing money in their hands. It makes you feel better. You feel like you've done something. You can pat yourself on the back and say, what a good person I am. But usually you are hurting them because they will take that money and use it for alcohol or drugs. That is most of the time what is happening. It's so much better if you want to give to the street people, to find a good mission, some shelter, some place that works with these people and provide support in that way. We need to recognize humbly that we will not always make the right decisions. Sometimes we will pass by on the other side and the parable of the Good Samaritan should resonate in our ears. Again, recognize that we, on occasion, regularly make poor decisions. Further, there's a need for balance. Right now, you could liquidate all of your assets. You could become homeless. And you could pour all of your assets out to help the street people. And it would be like taking a drop of liquid and putting it into the ocean. It would be gone. You need to have balance and recognize that tending to material needs of outsiders is not something that should be all-consuming. The Bible is clear, if your family is in need, that's a priority, and you must do everything you can to take care of the real needs of your family. Further, the Bible is also clear that if members of the church are in need, other members of the church, if they don't have family to take care of them, the church is their family, and we need to do that. But in terms of dealing with the poor of this world, Jesus was clear. The poor you will have with you always. You cannot delude yourself into thinking you will solve that problem. The question is, in balance, what is appropriate to do? There are economic idols that have taken our attention away from God. One of the thoughts that is recurring in our series of lessons is that worship is about God. But when we let something take the place of God, something called the shots in our thinking, then that thing has become an idol. In our culture, materialism has become an idol to many people. We see this in people who have been overrun by socialism. All socialism, whether you're talking about the hard socialism of the far left communists or the softer socialism that is prevalent in our society, all of it is materialistic. And, by the way, when you look carefully, it is anti-Christian. It's not an accident that left-wing individuals tend to be hostile to traditional religion. Socialism claims that the highest good is the redistribution of wealth. But certainly the Bible does not support that. The Bible is clear that there will be rich and there will be poor, and that there is nothing to be gained by simply taking money and throwing it up in the air every so often and letting everyone take an even share. Socialism leads a lot of people away from the God of the Bible. But let's be very clear. Objectivism is also a problem. This would be unfettered capitalism, embodied in that slogan from the past, greed is good. The idea that people acting selfishly will make a better world. This is not true. People just simply acting in self-interest are simply being selfish, and that's anti-Christian. Now, I believe capitalism has a lot of very wise and useful points, but it is a means to an end, not an end to itself. And the idea that acting in your self-interest rather than looking to the interest of others is completely contrary to the biblical narrative. We need rather to be thinking in terms of stewardship, not merely looking at our good, but looking to the glory of God. This needs to be our approach to giving, whether you're talking about giving on the Lord's Day, which is voluntary. You are to determine yourself how much to give, or whether you're talking about giving in other contexts. When you do it to the glory of God, it is worship. Stewardship requires us not to just look to our own interest, and certainly not to sell ourselves out to some political utopia, but to look to the glory of God and to see how, through a compassionate use of our material goods, we can accomplish great things in this world. Worship is defined by God, and that is true in our giving. Let's worship the Lord in the splendor of holiness. Thank you for joining me, and we'll pick up there in our next class.
Worship the King.